Next up, we've got Leigh Cockell from Connectwise. He's a cybersecurity expert. He's a certified information security manager and has over 15 years in IT and security. So please welcome to the stage, Leigh.
So thanks for the introduction. My name is Leigh Cockell. As John kindly said, I'm a certified information security manager. What does that mean? Basically, it means that I have expertise and experience in information security governance. And the easiest way of explaining that to people, it's basically relating security to business objectives. So what do you need to perform in your business in order to keep your business running? What's of value to you? And information governance talks about those concepts and tries to align any security to those principles. I'm going to talk today about cyber threats and cyber resilience, and we're going to go through a few concepts. We're going to expand on a few sort of real-world scenarios, and I'm going to try and give a picture of what the security landscape looks like. So my intro slide, we don't need to do this again, but there's me sitting on a desk. We've got our topics for today. Going to cover the cyber threat landscape. I'm going to talk about critical national infrastructure and hostile nation states. John sort of covered a little bit on that and talked about things like the WannaCry virus, and that was a hostile nation state attack. And typically we see these have been trending. There's the sort of main threats that we see, but there's a lot more out there, so I'm going to expand a little bit. We're going to look at the impact of cybercrime to small to medium-sized businesses. We'll look at some real-world examples, look at briefly the role of insurance, and then we'll look at why security commonly fails. Going to cover what does good look like, talk a little bit about threat intelligence, and things you can do today. So starting off, the cyber threat landscape has changed. Why is that? It's primarily because how we work and the world has changed. Everybody's aware now that predominantly we're working remotely, and that landscape and infrastructure has changed significantly due to things like COVID. We're now working from our office spaces, but also working from home, and our threat landscape has really significantly changed. The landscape includes your home environment as well as the office. Now, I work for a company called Connectwise. We're a software vendor. We provide security services to managed service providers such as Breakwater IT. But in order to make sure that we are providing the right type of information, the right platform, we need to reach out to the target market, and that is end customers, small business owners, and we carry out a survey each year. And we speak to around about 700 small businesses. And when I mean small business, I mean 10 to 1,000 employees. There's a big report that we produce every year based on this. And we ask questions like, have you been compromised? What was most significant to you in terms of the impact to the company, and what do you need to see? Now, overwhelmingly, we're finding more and more people are being impacted. So far in the past 5 years, 76% of those companies we've spoken to have been impacted by a cyber threat of some sort. That's a really large number. I know it's spread over 5 years, but still, you're getting to a state where pretty much everybody needs to be worrying about cyber threats. Interestingly, though, majority are still saying, we haven't got the skills in-house. We need someone to help us. So we are all looking towards our managed service providers, the people looking after our technology, to help us. Now, other interesting thing here is that 43% say they lack trust in their provider. And I think the biggest issue here is that it's to do with transparency, right? It's to do with clarity, transparency, and understanding what your technology provider's doing. So I think we have an obligation on my side as software vendors, also anybody looking after your technology, to be clear about what we're doing, to be open and transparent. So we're going to open out and have a look at how cybercrime has been evolving. John's history lesson was great. It sort of gave us a picture of what's happened in the past, and we want to look at what's happening in the present. Now, there are lots of resources for this. You can go out and you can look at the NCSC report. They do an annual review, and that's freely available information. Recommend taking a look at that. You'll see in there that your attacks are predominantly ransomware, business email compromise. There's some more supply chain attack going on. Supply chain attack is when vendors are compromised, people like the likes of the company I work for. So it's important things we need to be looking out for. Additionally, hostile nation states continue to be a problem. And you'll see that there's been a lot of activity in hostile nation states. Now, a lot of that is directly between the Ukraine and Russia recently, but that does continue to be a significant threat for most people. Talking about critical national infrastructure and hostile nation states, really there are sort of two places that threats can originate from. And they are hostile nation states which are basically countries whose motivation is to sow, I suppose, confusion, chaos, exfiltrate data, to financially harm another country or to get sort of intelligence on that country. The other type of attack is sort of financially motivated attacks, and they tend to be independent groups, people just trying to make money, basically, criminal organizations. Now, critical national infrastructure has sort of got controls around certain industries. So we've got industries, if you're in healthcare, public sector, energy, finance, transport. There are some controlling factors that say that these are sort of things you need to be looking out for because we know we are targets. What a lot of people don't realize is that critical national infrastructure doesn't mean large business. In fact, critical national infrastructure can mean all of these types of business. Most people in the room, if we ask them, if I do a show of hands right now, how many of you deal with industries in these sectors? Yep, and that's what we typically see. If you start to look around the room, you realise that we're all involved in critical national infrastructure in some way, shape, or form, or the majority of us are. So you're always going to be a target for those hostile nation states, even if you only have a small part to play. Now, the other sort of risk I wanted to talk about, or threat, was that critical national infrastructure, while it is a significant threat, and it always will be, is probably not the primary threat for a small to medium-sized business. The primary threat these days is financially motivated attacks. Specifically, we're talking about ransomware and business email compromise. Ransomware being a malicious threat, a tool that's going to be run on your environment, encrypt your data and hold you to ransom. Business email compromise can be a varying number of things. Pretty much works on the concept of social engineering or confidence tricking you into finding some way of gaining financial information or infiltrating a payment, getting in the middle of something. But both of them have the same motivation. It's to get money out of you. The ransomware space has evolved over the past few years, and I think John was talking about sort of 2014, 2015, we saw early attacks. I actually had an early ransomware attack on one of my own computers in that period of time. At the time, wasn't a big deal, just dealt with it, no real issue. I had appropriate backups, but ransomware's really evolved and changed, and we've got the concept now of ransomware as a service. Ransomware as a service has been around for a couple of years at least now, but it's very much changed the landscape. And we have this system where there are skilled developers, people that create these threats, and they create toolkits. And those toolkits allow individuals to go out and launch smaller scale attacks. So ransomware actors used to be, a small group of people need to attack a large business in order to make it worth their while and time. With ransomware as a service, they can sell those tools, a couple of £100 a pop, maybe £500, sell it to 1,000 people who are interested in hacking. Those 1,000 people go out and then target 10 companies each. All of a sudden, you've got 100,000 or 1 million companies that you're able to attack. And even if the amount of money they're getting is relatively small, it adds up, and it adds up quickly. You know, ransomware groups, you know, taking hundreds of millions every year. The whole industry, I think, is worth something in the region of 8 trillion. You know, so huge money right now. We don't see all of the attacks, but those groups are getting more sophisticated. They actually operate like sophisticated, organized units. You know, this was quite a sort of horrific statement that came out not so long ago, and this was by the Lockbit group. And they have a bug bounty program now. Bug bounty programs, if you've not sort of heard of them before, they are an invitation for you to find vulnerabilities in someone's software. So Connectwise, who I work for, we have a bug bounty program. We pay people to find a vulnerability in one of our applications, talk to us about it so we can patch it, right? Well, Lockbit also have a bug bounty program. If you can find a vulnerability that they can exploit, they'll pay you anything up to $1 million, right? So, you know, it shows how much money is in that and how organized they are. So, yeah, we've really got to adapt to these types of threats. I sort of hinted on in terms of the landscape changing, and the landscape has significantly changed, and part of that is home working. And just a few stats, this was gathered from an information statistic. I think 1,000 companies were contacted, and following COVID, predominantly, on average, 70% of them were saying that they had been impacted by home working. Yeah, their attack surfaces increased. They could see a visible impact to their threats. When we look at all these things, traditionally people used to think of these things as enterprise issues. So it's only going to hit a large business. Yeah, I'm not big enough. I don't have enough money. I don't have enough customers or in a space where it's going to be a viable target. It's no longer the case. Those ransomware as a service models have meant that the targets are no longer the whales, as a terminology, as they call them. They don't have to be the big single target that they can get a lot of money out of. They can attack lots and lots of smaller targets, and that is now the primary model. 70% of attacks are on small to medium-sized businesses. Now, there is some reasoning in the background of this. There's been some really high-profile attacks which have changed the outlook of ransomware. One was the Colonial Pipeline attack, which occurred last year. And that stopped fuel supply in America, in the US. Now, the implication of that was that the US government really reacted. They got extremely frustrated. They assigned the FBI, they assigned Interpol, and they started going after these threat actors, and they started classifying them as terrorists. And what that did is it suddenly put the heat on those organizations. And we're seeing some of those ransomware groups really feeling that now. So there are a number of them have been arrested. There's a number of them have been disbanded. Some of them have started leaking information about their own groups. And some of those groups have, split because of that. We see groups like Conti, who are another group who are very, very active. They have split into several splinter groups. Revil, which was another big group, many of those members were arrested. Now, this all sounds great, but it's not going to stop the problem. It just means that the problem is getting slightly less organized and more dispersed. So for our industry, for small to medium-sized business, actually probably not going to help, because it just means that small to medium-sized businesses are going to be even more of a better target for these groups, because they don't want to be touching the large enterprise anymore, because there comes too much heat with that. It's too much recognition when they become targets. They have a number over their head. I want to look at the true impact of cybercrime. So we are probably all aware that when there is a ransom, there is a ransom payment we need to hold. But Ransom really is just the beginning of the story. And typically, ransom, if you're in a company, a threat actor has had access to your environment for a bit of time. We call it dwell time. Typically, for ransomware, about 30 days. They've been in your environment for at least 30 days. And they're doing reconnaissance. They're trying to work out what your annual revenue is, what your key documents are, who your customers are, and what levers they can pull to leverage you to pay a ransomware. John talked about the example where the company had backups. That's great. You've got backups you can recover. Not always the whole story, because a lot of these groups are looking for, right, I'm going to assume that you might be able to recover from my ransomware attack, where I encrypt everything. But can I target your customers? Can I send an email to your customers saying that their data's been exfiltrated? Can I really leverage that sensitivity piece? And a lot of the time, the answer is yes, they can. So the story doesn't stop there. Ransom is around about 10% of your annual revenue, typically. Ransomware can be, we're going to hold you for ransom for up to 10% of your revenue, but we see typically it only represents 20% of the true cost. The rest is in your reputational impact, it's to do with fines, it's to do with the operational downtime. We see on average a company that has been ransomed, and I'm not just talking about an individual machine. If we spot a ransom early, we can stop it to an individual machine. And a lot of the services John mentioned have that exact aim to find things early and limit the impact. But if we haven't got those tools, we haven't got those detection methods, then average downtime is 23 days. So you're not able to operate as a business for 23 days. I want to talk about some real-world examples and just to highlight how different people have dealt with threats. And the key point here I want to sort of convey is that anybody can be a target, right? And there are companies, and one of the companies in this list specifically is a very mature cybersecurity operator and has some good controls in place. Doesn't mean you're not going to be a target. Doesn't mean it's impossible for you to be compromised. But I wanted to give some examples of companies doing it well and being prepared versus companies who are unprepared. Now, Pendragon were quite a good example, and they're a good example about transparency. We talked about trust earlier and transparency. Pendragon were a car dealership, and they had a compromise. They immediately notified all of the ICO, all of their customers. They created web blogs. They also took a court injunction out so that legally data couldn't be shared. So anybody who had that data would be basically liable to being sued. They communicated all of this out and had an action plan. It was a really good example of a company that was ready for a cyber attack. They had an instant response method. They understood what they did. Now, I'm not going to comment on whether they should have been attacked or not. That's kind of regardless of the example we're giving here. The point is that they, in the industry, and a lot of people were very refreshed by their approach, because the way they dealt with it gave confidence that although they've been compromised, they were dealing it in the best way possible. The next company on this list is LastPass, provide password management. They've had a couple of security breaches in the past year. Now, the reason I wanted to highlight this, and this is all public knowledge, this isn't anything that, I'm not giving away any sort of state secrets or anything here, but LastPass, they have communicated fairly well. They've been pretty transparent about what's happened. But the thing I wanted to highlight here is that LastPass prepared for this. They had security by design. And security by design means that although they have been compromised, none of your passwords have been, because they have a zero trust methodology where even they don't have access to your passwords. So although they've been compromised, your passwords haven't. Happy days, right? Now, it's a good example because it shows that they've taken the right approach in terms of expecting the worst to happen, and they've got some contingency in place. Last one is pretty much an example of how not to do it, and that's Medibank in Australia. And they were not prepared. They didn't communicate well. There's been zero transparency. Entire medical records for everybody that's been working with them have been hacked. They initially just said, we're not paying the ransom, not talking to you, not got any kind of contingency plans in place. Government says we don't have to, so we're not going to. Since that problem, people's mental health records have been leaked, sexual health records have been leaked, and finally, everything has been leaked on the dark web. They're now facing fines of $1 billion, up to $1 billion as a company because of all the data that's been leaked. What's going to happen with them? Don't know, but it's really not the right way to react in these scenarios. Now I want to talk about the role of insurance just briefly, and you'll have more detail about this, but insurance is there for high-risk, low-probability scenarios. Now, a high-risk, low-probability scenario basically means that you have a risk in your organization. The likelihood of it occurring, somebody maybe is ransomware, it's low. But the impact to your company is going to harm you significantly. And you can take cyber insurance out against these things, right? And it is one of the recommended methods of dealing with that scenario. The issue is that these scenarios are no longer low probability. Insurance companies know that. They've seen the stats. They've been having to pay out of it as an industry. It's been significantly hurting them. So what you're seeing now is that there are additional controls in most insurance policies. It's calling out things like having EDR software, having instant response, having monitoring services, having security awareness training. People are the biggest weakness in any kind of security ecosystem. And they're not just saying this to make your life difficult. They're saying this because they have seen the stats, they've seen the data, and they know companies that deploy these methods, it won't stop them from being a target. They may still be hit, but the impact once they are hit financially is far, far lower. Rather than the whole company being compromised, it might just be one machine. So it's there for a reason. Why does security fail? It's a good example here. It's an example of a control. And some of the reasons security fails is because we don't think about all the scenarios. So we've got a barrier here. It's blocking a road. But people are people. Just because there's a barrier there, there's no fence. We'll just drive around the barrier. And security controls can be exactly the same. We need to adapt for the people elements of controls. The concept of adapting for the people elements is a combination of people, process, and technology. So we look at a security approach and we need to adapt it and think about what are the people elements, how are we training people, what's their understanding, what are the processes they can use to make sure they respond in the same way, they've got repeatable processes, and then what technology have we got to scale that. We've got a matrix here that sort of talks about what happens if you have gaps. Predominantly what happens is that if you have technology but no people and process, you have some AI doing a wonderful job. It's got no understanding of what's important to you. It's just responding in a stock standard way, probably going to block lots of things that could be a threat, probably going to block lots of things that aren't a threat. It's also probably going to have no context in terms of which parts of your organization are more critical to you than others. There's no context involved. The people element provides that context. If you've got people and process, you've probably got quite a good security approach. You've got people who understand what they should be doing, but scaling that across an organization is difficult without the technology. So we want to combine these three things for it to really work well. So what does good look like? So when we talk about what does good look like, we have to have a starting point. And I think we highlighted before that there are lots of different scenarios, lots of different threats. We can have different tools, technologies in places. But fundamentally, you've all got a slightly different use case, and you've got slightly different things that are valuable to you as a company. And this is the whole concept of security frameworks. Security frameworks let you look at your organization and give you a set of rules. And I put a book definition in a simple one, but really you're looking at a desired state in security, and a security framework is a sort of rule book or a set of controls and processes that will help you get to that desired state. Now we can help with this scenario with doing things like risk assessments, doing cyber assessments as well. These can help towards getting towards these controls and security frameworks. Got some examples: NIST, CIS, COBIT, ISO 27001. When we use a framework, we can break down risk into functions. This is the NIST framework, and we've looked at identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, and we can think of this as a life cycle as well. We identify the things in our company which are important to us, the things that are really earn us the money and keep the money and keep the company going. We then try to protect those things. We also need to think about the concept of, I have my protection layers in place, I maybe have my firewalls, I have my endpoint protection, but what if those things fail? How do I detect those failures? And that's where the detection piece comes in. Then we have response, which looks at, right, I've detected something, but how do I respond to it? Do I just shut down my computer? Well, no, you don't, because if it's a ransomware attack, it's one of the worst things you can do, because you can lose encryption keys, you can lose the ability to recover. You also tip off the threat actor. You're far better disconnecting from the network, right? But there are lots of different scenarios where you can lower the impact by understanding what threats you have presented to you. Additionally, you've got recover. So all else has failed, and to John's point earlier, they had a really good backup solution and ring-fence backup solution, and they were able to recover the data and get the business back up and operational. It's a critical part of this ecosystem. When we then look at that being a cycle, if we've had some kind of implication, some kind of compromise, then we can cycle through and we can go, what have we learned? What have we learned from this? Is there anything else we need to protect? And we can apply some additional controls. I wanted to give a quick example that makes some of this easier to understand, and it's just sort of taking this analogy and talking about a house. So when we've got a house, we have a door and a lock. And there are protection elements. They're stopping people from getting into our building. We expand this concept to technology, and it's similar to having a firewall and antivirus. Those things are to stop people from getting into our environment. But they're seen as basic controls. We look at our office location, it's more than likely you have additional controls in place to help look after your office location. You have those doors and locks, but you've probably got alarms, you've probably got perimeter security, you've got security cameras for monitoring, and you've probably got some kind of security firm which can respond to warnings on those cameras, or maybe come out and look at the building and have some form of response. Technology is similar. We can have similar controls in place for this detection and response elements. We can have our monitoring through security cameras, and typically we look at SOC-based solutions, Security Operations Center-based solutions, where we have someone monitoring your environments, recording that activity. We have alarms in EDR products, these advanced systems that are detecting and responding. You can think of them as your alarm system for your environment. We can then align all these things to looking at your securities and tools, and we can align them to this cybersecurity framework we've talked about. So this is the NIST framework, and we've got identify, protect, detect, respond. And I've just put some of the technologies. Don't worry about what those technologies are in huge amounts of detail. This is just a way for you to understand that when we're talking about technologies and services, they are aligned to a certain type of risk. And if you have that certain type of risk in your organization, and the security frameworks will help you determine that, there are services that can help towards that. So we've got a basic set of services. We've got some more granular layers you can go into, and you can go further into that. There are layers under layers under layers, depending on what risk you have in your organization and how secure you want to be. Now, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Mike Tyson quote. Now, the reason why I wanted to put this in here is because so far we've been talking about how we can prepare. But the goal isn't to completely remove risk. It would be nice if we could, but that doesn't represent reality. Now, reality shows us that threats are going to be ever present, and we need the ability to react appropriately. If you remember those examples I gave, those examples were companies who all got hit, but they reacted completely differently. And part of that is to do with how they have prepared and who they have in their corner. So you need to have somebody in your corner that's going to help you with instant response. And there's a number of ways of doing this. One of the ways of doing this is to have a cyber research unit or a research unit and a security operations team or a security operations center. There's just some stats here. In Connectwise, we have a security operations center, and this is the type of activity they do across a year. We're constantly monitoring and detecting compromise and looking for threats. What do we find? So we find that there are statistics that we collect, and we produce an annual report, and we can tell you what sectors are being targeted and what types of attacks. Now, this is important information because this helps us determine what are the techniques and tactics being used by threat actors. And it's one of the most complicated parts of security detection and monitoring. Security operations centers are made up of analysts that are looking for indicators of compromise. They're called IOCs. And the IOCs are blueprints or fingerprints of a threat that is persistent in your environment. But how do we know what they look like? We know what they look like by research. How do we keep up to date? We keep up to date by monitoring. Now, this type of information has shown us the types of attacks that have been the most prolific. So Lockbit, very, very active. Conti Group, very, very active. Avedon 2021 was very active. Avedon are no more, disbanded group. Black Hat, very active as well. Black Hat have been much more active in this past year as well. Some of these groups have grown, some of these groups have splintered, but the point is that we need to understand who these groups are, what they've been doing, and what behaviors and techniques they use. Now, if we understand the tactics or the behaviors, we can fight against that. We can determine what techniques and tactics have been used. It's commonly known as TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures. Now, I've shown the pyramid of pain, and this highlights the different types of attacks. So now at the bottom, we've got hash values. So this is your traditional malware viruses from sort of 10, 15, 20 years ago, all the way up to today. They're just a malware hidden in a file. They're quite easy to detect. They're also quite easy to change. Now, the point here is that you can put some simple controls in place, and you're going to find these things at the bottom. But additionally, the threat actors can keep changing those as well. As you move up, the threats become more challenging to detect. But equally, they become more complex for the threat actors as well, and they become more challenging for them to change. So you see at the top there, we've got TTPs. If we understand TTPs, it's difficult for us to monitor them, and we have to have some advanced solutions, some SOC-backed solutions to monitor those things. But equally, they don't change very frequently. And I put some tools and technology that can help at the different layers. Now, the tactics and technologies are defined by a group called MITRE, the MITRE Attack Framework. And there's a whole massive list of these things. You don't need to know all these things, but basically they categorize all the techniques that are used. So if I looked at a typical attack, say a ransomware attack, there would be 8 to 10 of these tactics used. And they would range from initial access, which would be how they got into your system, and typically that's going to be people sending you a phishing email. 80% of attacks start with email and people clicking on malicious links. So that's your initial access vector. Most of the time is that. And then they need to have some kind of privilege escalation so that they can gain admin privileges and then execute some kind of payload. The point is, all of those top threat actors that I showed you, they all share common blueprints. When we're talking about these tactics and techniques, We don't need to look at every single one of these. We need to understand which ones are there. Sorry, John. 2 minutes. Yeah. We just need to understand what are the common ones. So those threat actor groups, the likes of Lockbit, Conti, all of them use these 5 groups. So we can turn the table on its head and we can say, as long as we can look for these things, we are going to detect the threats by all of these threat actor groups. And these things are very difficult for them to change. They might be able to change the tools in the background, but the actual approach that they use is typically the same. They're going to continue using emails. They're going to continue using elevation to try to get an admin privilege. As long as we can search for these things and look for these things, we can detect these threats. And we can stop them where they are. Additionally, if we know what threat actor group is, we know what their next steps are going to be. We know what to look out for. We can tell you how far down their attack chain they've gone. We can do that with forensic information. We can do that root cause analysis, and instead of taking 2 months, we can find what that attack and the entry point was much earlier, so you can respond appropriately. So that just gives a little bit of insight in terms of what SOC teams are doing in the background, but what can you do today? The thing I urge you to do really is don't get into all that complexity right now. The thing that you should be looking at right now is cyber assessment. It should be doing risk assessment across your business. Talk to Breakwater, talk to your technology provider. What can they tell you about your risk? What can they tell you about cyber frameworks? What types of vulnerabilities can you look at? Because that's going to help then take you to the next stage of the conversation and focus on things that are relevant to you. Wanted to point out, and so just sort of wrapping up now, security is a journey. Don't try and eat the elephant all at once, right? It's an impossible thing to do. We're also not going to fix anything overnight. It's got to be something we continually do, and we've got to continually review. We've got to constantly improve. So take those assessments, draw out a roadmap, and then just keep on reviewing. Things are going to change over time, but as long as you are reviewing and you're on that train, you're doing a lot more than most people. And that finishes out. I think we're taking questions later. So if you do have any questions, please hold them. And I've probably gone over a little bit of time, so I'm going to hand back over.